I had built up an identity of someone who achieved great things. I had built up an identity of someone who served other people, and that was where my value came from. I grew up in a family, and my mother and father were both born in the Great Depression, the late 1920s. And they emphasized the importance of your identity is to be a person of service, a person who lives a life of meaning. And now here I was with all this pressure to perform and to succeed and to strive to get into Harvard or else, you know. And so I did all of these things, and I, from the outside, had everything. You know, I had a very respectable profession, a cardiologist. And yet, as my outer identity seemed so strong, my inner world felt like it was cracking. I had so much confusion about what was the point of my life. I knew how to perform for others. I knew how to succeed. I could put my head down and I could keep it there for hours, whether it was, you know, solving math problems or doing chess competitions or whatever it was. I mean, the grit and the endurance, I didn't have a problem with that. But what I didn't have was a clear fire inside of me that was pulling me towards something very, very special. Thank you.
Dr. Jonathan, you are very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled to have you on the show today.
What a pleasure to be here, crossing the pond together in spirit, and I can't wait to get into the conversation.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, I have very, very fond memories of North Carolina. When we were scaling our previous business, North America was the last significant region for us to enter into, and North Carolina is where we set up our first sales office. So I know you're based there at the moment. Given all things scaling, you're the first cardiologist we've had on the show. So you hold the privilege and honor of being the first cardiologist. And I'm going to give context for this afterwards, but our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. It seems a strange question to pose to a cardiologist, but what does scaling with purpose mean to you, Jonathan?
Yeah, it may seem strange, but it's not strange at all. I am so passionate about speaking with business leaders. I can't tell you how many patients come into my heart clinic and into my hospital who are business leaders, who are so focused on scaling their business, but doing it in a way that ignores the needs of the human heart. And it ends up eroding and inflaming and causing so many issues with the physical heart itself. And so the message here today is that you can't separate the different dimensions of our heart. So for me, what it means to scale with purpose, when I think about the word scale, it means to grow, but it means to grow in a very specific way. It's not just to tack on and put a new department and a new division and a new vertical in the business model. It has to do with growing with a clear set of instructions, that as the business grows, those clear instructions, and really it's around culture. What do we stand for? And I think what happens in businesses when you go past, let's say, the 200 employee mark or even 2,000, there can be a lost sense of what are we all here for? And people start marching in their own directions. So for me, scaling, and whether this is me scaling my family, we have 5 in our family, or scaling in my own personal pursuits, you know, I've taken care of 30,000 patients. But I have to remember what it takes to take care of just one. And so for me, scaling with purpose means, why did I go into this in the first place, this business, this entrepreneurial venture, whatever it is? And keeping that top of mind and communicating that so clearly that everyone who works around me knows exactly, not just what I stand for, but now what we stand for as we grow.
Oh my goodness, I have chills in the back of my neck. Everything that you've said resonates so strongly. And I feel it's really important, given that I have a very experienced cardiologist in front of me, to acknowledge my own challenge with my health in the last 18 months. I was one of those business leaders who unfortunately had an untimely visit to and had an emergency angioplasty after suffering a STEMI. These are terms that I came to know afterwards, but an ST elevated myocardial infarction, essentially for the layman, heart attack, blockage to my lower anterior descending artery. Unfortunately, it gets the very grave term of a widowmaker heart attack. So I have unfortunately experience of this, and I want to acknowledge that right at the outset in terms of maintaining the authenticity of the podcast and the context by which you're on today. I wanted to share a little bit of my own experience, because if I had known some of the symptoms prior, I may have came to visit one of your peers earlier. I had a jaw pain for about 6 months, which I thought was associated with a root canal that I needed done. I had a little bit of nausea every time I had eaten something, which I thought was a gastro issue, and I had swollen ankles after I trained, which myself and my wife used to laugh at. So that's a little bit of the background. You mentioned, and you've referred to it in your opening when you answered that first question, Jonathan. I took care of 20,000 other hearts before taking care of my own. Can you share with our listeners what you mean by that?
Brendan, I first want to honor and acknowledge what you just shared with vulnerability, with authenticity, and really in a very wholehearted way. You're showing up for me, and I'm your guest, and yet at the same time, you're showing up for me as a human being, and I'm honored by that. And right now I'm not a cardiologist. I'm just a fellow man. So it really means a lot to be here with you and to talk about these things, because I have a sense, and you'll correct me, but I have a sense that what happened to you personally may be driving some of your passion to help others avoid the same fate. So.
Absolutely, and it's the reason why we do what we do, and we encourage business leaders to scale with purpose. Undergirding that is to do that with joy, flow, and ease. We always say that it's pointless getting to the summit of that mountain that you wish to climb if by the time you get there, you're a frazzled wreck, your health is deteriorated, your closest relationships are in bits, and your team are strung all along the mountainside wondering why the hell did you drag us up here, that it was hollow whenever you actually arrive there. What we want leaders to do, of course, is to scale with purpose, to challenge themselves, to challenge their teams in a way that's anchored in a purpose that has clarity of vision, and they arrive at the top of that mountain feeling that they have really accomplished something significant. They're high-fiving each other and they're saying, look over there, there's another mountain to climb, let's go. So that's the metaphor by which we coach leaders, and health and well-being of the leader is at the forefront of everything we do. So it was quite a shock to me, having trained my entire life, having been in a situation where my probability of a cardiac event was in the lowest percentile, albeit when I examine that now, both parents have had heart disease, had heart attacks, my aunts, uncles, grandparents, and I had a little sinister outlier called APA, which was just off the scale. So I was probably one of those. There was an inevitability to my situation, but thankfully I'm here to speak with you. But look, today is about you and about your incredible journey and about your incredible book, and I want to bring your experience into the business world so that we can give value to our listeners in the context of scaling with purpose, undergirded with a sense of joy, flow, and ease in doing that.
I'm with you. I'm ready to climb the mountain. I'm ready to high five, and I'm ready to point to the next mountain.
Brilliant.
Brendan, you asked me what did it mean that I cared for 20,000 hearts before caring for my own, and it occurred to me in a very painful moment, and this was a dozen years ago, when my best friend, who was also my sister, Andrea, and I discuss her in the book. In fact, the whole reason I wrote my book and I do what I do is to bring her spirit with me, with us, because she was all about joy and connection and purpose and celebration. And so Andrea was young. She was not yet 40, and she was a doctor, a radiology specialist. and she was having blurring of her vision. And she had a newborn child at home and had been recently married. And ultimately, she, on her own scan, discovered that she had a tumor in the center of her brain. And Andrea was the one person in my life who had seen that what used to be a happy-go-lucky boy filled with curiosity, over many years struggling with anxiety secretly, struggling with depression without talking about it, without it even acknowledging it to people close to me. She was the one person who helped me be kind to myself and to give me the support that I needed to get past my shame that there was something wrong with me, to get help, mental health help, to even see a therapist, which I was terrified. It was funny how scared I was walking into the office, and it was because of Andrea's encouragement and empowerment. And so when I heard the news that she told me, my blurring of the vision is a tumor and no one in the world is able to remove it, I knew that life was changing for the worse. And I hadn't yet gone through all of the therapy, so I was still struggling inside. And now my foundation in my life, it felt, in addition, I was also newly married. I also had a newborn son. It felt like my foundation was cracking. And at the same time, if I look back, during my weekday and weekend hours, I was going to work and taking care of 2,000 to 3,000 patients every year. And so I would show up with my stethoscope, and the metaphor was so powerful for me that I'm putting it on each and every one of their hearts, and I'm listening so carefully to help them prevent heart attack and to live long. And I never had really turned that stethoscope onto my own heart to listen to the pain and to address the pain. And that's what I meant when I said I helped care for 20,000 hearts before caring for my own.
That's quite incredible. Just picking up on that, because certainly my own sense of identity was absolutely rocked, because I always identified as somebody who is incredibly healthy and well, especially 49 years of age, coming into my 50th year. I've just felt brilliant, and almost looked around at others who, let's say, had let themselves go over the last couple of decades, thinking they've made life very, very tough for themselves. So whenever I ended up in a cardiac ward with people around me who were those people that I thought had heart attacks, overweight, elderly, smoking, and I can't identify with any of these people, my identity was completely rocked. What about your identity whenever, you're the carer, not the cared? How did you overcome, I suppose, the stigma of going to visit a therapist whenever you're supposed to be that person who is the rock for everyone else?
Yeah. You described that so powerfully just now. So much of the struggle that I had was around identity. I had built up an identity of someone who achieved great things. I had built up an identity of someone who served other people, and that was where my value came from. I grew up in a family, and my mother and father were both born in the Great Depression, the late 1920s. And they emphasized the importance of your identity is to be a person of service, a person who lives a life of meaning. And now here I was with all this pressure to perform and to succeed and to strive to get into Harvard or else, And so I did all of these things, and I, from the outside, had everything. I had a very respectable profession, a cardiologist. And yet, as my outer identity seemed so strong, my inner world felt like it was cracking. I had so much confusion about what was the point of my life. I knew how to perform for others. I knew how to succeed. I could put my head down and I could keep it there for hours, whether it was, solving math problems or doing chess competitions or whatever it was. I mean, the grit and the endurance, I didn't have a problem with that. But what I didn't have was a clear fire inside of me that was pulling me towards something very, very special. It was more externally based. And so when Andrea got sick, When I became utterly exhausted by 10 to 12-hour days, including weekends, unpredictable sleep, often sometimes no sleep at all, which ultimately led to the worst version of myself. If I was the owner of a business, and essentially I was, but it was the business of healing hearts, I was doing, pardon my French, a shitty job of managing my own business, my own life, my own family. I was rude to my wife. I was unkind to my children. And I was ashamed of how I was behaving. And I'm supposed to be a healer of others. This was my identity. So I can't tell you, Brendan, how many splits and cracks in this idea of identity were coming up. And it really, for me, had to hit rock bottom, where I was literally curled on the wooden floor of my New York loft with my wife, just crying when my sister was dying, saying, what is the point of all of this? Where am I going? And for me, in a way, looking back, it was the greatest blessing. Because I had an external identity, or many of them up until that point, and that forced me to begin the process of discovering what my real identity was, and finding out that there's this whole poetry of identity, that you don't have to have just one. You can be anything and everything, and it can change. And in fact, to develop a business, to grow, to help lead others, in many ways, I'm not suggesting that we are chameleons adapting, to match other people, but I am suggesting that flexibility is one of the core features of being an effective leader. And to do that, we have to be flexible with who am I? And the one moment I can be compassionate, the other moment I can be wise, the other moment I can be courageous, the other moment I can be loud, and then the next moment I can be very quiet. And in the most effective leaders that I know, there's a flexibility that comes there in people who've explored this idea of identity and who am I for others.
You have articulated that so brilliantly and so eloquently and so poetically. There's lots of ways we can go here. Our approach, again, when we're coaching leaders, is one where we encourage leaders to lead self first before they lead others, before they lead the organization. We use the abbreviation CEO as Chief Energy Officer. It's really important that you fill your own cup up first before you try to give to others and fill the cup of others. And ultimately, what we've discovered through years of coaching leaders is that the business will never scale beyond the identity of the leader. So this whole question of identity is so critically important. What is interesting in your case, and in many ways my own, is we leave it until trauma before we trigger a change. And what I want to appeal to people to do is to not wait on the trauma before you trigger the change, but to ignite the change before the trauma ever has to happen. What's your belief on this now, Jonathan, in terms of what can we do to avoid the trauma but begin the change?
Brendan, I love how deep you're going here. This is really root level stuff. We're getting into the basement now, and I really like it. So I have two minds as I'm thinking about this question. On the one hand, my Hollywood answer is, well, we can give people enough warning, enough insight, enough statistics. Right? We can speak to their minds and tell them, even make the business case. Your business is going to do even better if you take care of yourself and if you live with your purpose and you make sure everyone around you is clear on their purpose. We could show exactly how many hundreds of thousands of dollars you're going to lose in employee turnover if you don't have a culture that's based in connection. We could make the business case to the head. And then there's another mind, Brendan, where I almost believe that we need to have some of the pain. We need to have the pain. Without that pain, I think we may not be able to savor the greatest pleasures. Now, I could be wrong on that. And I'm sure there are people who are going to come and say, I'm living my best life all the time. I'm savoring, I'm grateful, and I'm generous. And I've never had a moment of pain. And so I don't think we need people to go to profound loss, to profound injury, to accidents to get to a point of waking up. The invitation here, I think if someone who's listening now is being really honest with themselves, they've already had the pain. They've already experienced it. Now, maybe, at least from what I've seen in my clinic, maybe they've been very skilled at covering it up.
Yeah, your response to that question leads me to think about an experiment that Jordan Peterson talked about in a podcast I listened to recently. And he mentioned this, described a tube that a mouse was sent down, and they wafted cheese into the top of the tube and attached a little spring coil to the mouse's tail. And essentially the spring coil was a proxy for motivation. And when they wafted the cheese in, the mouse would run towards the cheese, but wouldn't quite get there. And in the context of the pain, at the back of the tube, then they wafted in the smell of a cat. And the mouse then ran significantly further towards the cheese. And I suppose what we're saying here is, and what you've described, we do need to be aware of what it is that we want, what direction we want to go in, and anchor that in a purpose that represents potentially pain if you don't go there. I'm not sure if I'm describing that correctly, but or I'm articulating that in the right way. But we're saying a vision in its own right will only get you so far, but we need the pain of a purpose to actually really act as a catalyst towards forward momentum.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear here. And what you're getting to is, the core of 3,000 years of philosophy, which is we have this existential pressure as humans. Once our frontal cortex develops enough, we realize we're going to die. And this is what's driven humans for millennia. And yet at the same time, you and I both know leaders in every industry, and you can see, is this person driven? Is there fire coming from a fear of their own mortality, trying to get it all done? And I've been a victim of this. As I passed 50 years old, I think about legacy, and I think about the brevity of life, and I lost my sister, and I lost my mother. And so at the same time, I've also experienced another way to lead and to live, which is not driven primarily by that fear. In fact, if we were to follow the Stoic philosophers, they had a very simple phrase with two words. They said, amor fati, which is to love your fate, whatever happens, whether I die, succeed, fail. See if you can love it all. And it's a whole nother way to go about leadership, where now instead of projecting your fear to those around you, fear of financial demise and job losses and the market instability, instead of always projecting that fear, because I'd write about this in the book, people can sense that fear and it activates their hearts in a certain way, in an unhealthy way. There's another option, and you embody this at the beginning when you described we high five along the way and we point to the next one. That's a vision. That's a positive vision that creates a whole different physiology inside of my chest. If I'm working with you and for you, I become healthier when I'm motivated by that kind of a vision than by a fear-based vision.
You've led us beautifully into your wonderful book. For those who are listening, you won't be able to see me holding up Dr. Jonathan Fisher's wonderful book, Just One Heart, A Cardiologist's Guide to Healing, Health and Happiness. And obviously this is very relevant to me, very close to my heart, excuse the pun, and it was gifted to me by my business partner, Claire. And Claire, I acknowledge you for having such a wonderful heart. You lead with the heart all of the time. Just an incredible person. You have outlined in this book 7 traits of the heart, and I'd love today to do a little bit of a mini master class, if you will, on those traits. And through the lens of business leadership, because you reference business leadership, you reference a past guest, the wonderful Bob Chapman, who has scaled his business incredibly by leading with the heart. So we want to, rather than that kind of just being a kind of Pollyanna, nice little term, we want to get into that today to see practically how the heck do we lead with the heart? We know what it does from a physiological perspective, but how do we leverage the heart from a leadership standpoint? So before we do that, a couple of things you mentioned at the outset of the book, and you coined these terms, heartbreakers and heart wakers. So what are heartbreakers and heart wakers?
I have to say how awesome it is, Brendan, just for a moment. I'm going to take 10 seconds now just to say that of all the things that you could be talking about in your life and all the podcasts, themes that you could have, that you want to talk about the heart and the heart of business. Think about the impact that's having on the future business leaders, young kids coming up, people who are in business school, maybe listening, who are used to be focused only on the bottom line, the almighty dollar. And now instead, you're incredibly successful, and you are setting an example that this is something that is worth talking about. The human heart, the human spirit. And I really have to acknowledge that, and then we can go into the answer.
Thank you. Well, I'll add to that, because I see what we do in terms of inspiring, connecting, and enabling ambitious leaders of small to medium-sized enterprise to scale with purpose as important, without overstating what we do, but ultimately these businesses represent 99% of businesses by volume in for the vast majority of our societies. They play a huge role. So people are operating under leaders at the moment. Right now, they're experiencing a tough time with the leader of the business. And they're going home and they will actually interact with the partner based on spending 8 or 9 hours with that leader today. And they will interact with their children based on spending 8 or 9 hours with that leader today. And that ripples out, and it impacts not only the business, because it's not contained within the business, it ripples out into society as a whole, again, without overstating what we're doing. But we see what we do as creating ripples, and if we can create enough of those ripples within SME leaders, then eventually those ripples join together and create a wave like what Bob Chapman's doing with the wonderful Barry Weimiller. And the point is here, there's no sacrifice here. It's not a case of, well, we sacrifice the P&L for giving people hugs. It's a case of, when you understand, when you lead with the heart, actually everyone is better off, including your stakeholders, because ultimately the P&L is better as a result. So everyone, there's no downside to this, which is why I'm so delighted that you've called it out and you've written a book specifically to address this. So thank you, right back at you.
Okay.
So
Thank you. I'm taking it. The ripples are great. So you asked me, Brendan, about this idea that just came to me. It's called the idea of heartbreakers. And this came to me about a dozen years ago when I saw a lady come into the hospital, and she was having what seemed like a heart attack, severe chest pain. So she's a healthy lady. She was 50 years old, exercised all the time, ate healthy. It looked like she was having a heart attack by her symptoms, and then we did a blood test, which really tells the truth if you're having a heart attack or not. And we were sure it was going to be maybe negative, but it was through the roof. She was having a heart attack. And then we did a very quick bedside test in the emergency room, a bedside ultrasound called an echocardiogram. Took a little probe in my hand, put it on her chest with some jelly. And in that moment, I could see her heart changing, getting weaker. This was a heart attack. And I also could see that something didn't fit in the story. And as we were preparing to take her for an emergency catheterization to check for blockages, I just followed a whim and I asked her, has there been any unusual event in your life lately? Any unusual stress? And she began to cry in that moment. And she said, my daughter was just admitted back into a drug rehabilitation program, and I found out yesterday. And that's when this started. We took her to the laboratory. We found 0 blockages in her arteries. She was having a broken heart from the emotional stress and the grief. And I had learned about this through my training, but it really wasn't sort of front of mind. It was called the broken heart syndrome, also called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, also called apical ballooning syndrome. And it occurred to me that this causes a broken heart, but we were missing something in the field of cardiology, focusing just on this one extreme situation, which everyone can recognize. The heart is breaking. And I thought back for 25 years of my practice, and I realized that there were really about 10 different situations, not just grief and stress, but other emotions that we were feeling and bringing with us on a day-to-day basis that were having a similar physiologic impact on the heart and the blood vessels throughout the whole body. And so I dove into the literature, and I spent 2 years researching this one heartbreaker, and I discovered that there is a weight of evidence that points to a group of emotional states that if we're not careful, these aren't bad emotional states. It's not bad to grieve or to feel stress, but if we're not careful and we carry these with us, evidence says we are at higher risk for a heart attack. And these include stress, chronic stress, emotional distress, anxiety, panic, depression, anger, hostility, loneliness, and grief. And so I coined these the heartbreakers so that people recognize that there's nothing wrong with feeling these things. All emotions are just information if we use them that way. On the other hand, in our society right now, there's so much pressure to rush, to succeed, to perform, and to, in a way, cover over these emotions and pretend like they don't exist, and to medicate them in other ways, whether it's alcohol or sex or porn, whatever it is. And we're not actually looking at these heartbreakers and healing them, which is what we need to do to protect our physical beating heart. Those are the heartbreakers, and being more of a positive person by nature, I realized I didn't want to spend my life researching the things that break our hearts. I wanted to give the same or actually even more attention in the worldview of an equal set of opposite and even more powerful emotional states. And in curiosity, I started reading the research to see what is the impact of certain positive emotions on our hearts. Can it do the opposite? Can it make us live longer? And I was surprised initially, and then as I read hundreds of papers, and I cite 300 of them in the back of the book, there are a set of emotions that can lower blood pressure, relax our heart, make us more open to connection with others, make us more effective leaders. And these emotions also are associated with human longevity. And I decided, well, what rhymes with breaker and has the connotation of waking us up, like you and I were talking? How can we help people wake up to their own lives before the trauma occurs? So I coined these the heart wakers. And these include things that you may recognize. We've heard they're all good for you, but did you know that they can literally help the physical heart as well for a variety of reasons? And these are gratitude, optimism, kindness, generosity, joy, laughter, purpose, compassion, and love. These are the heartbreakers, and these are the heart wakers. And for me, these are keys to the puzzle of living a good life.
I love them. Absolutely. And I love the term that you've coined there, heart wakers. So leveraging the heart wakers, you have defined these 7 traits of the heart. I'm curious, I get fascinated with numbers. Why 7? Why was it not 3? Why was it not 15? Why 7?
You want to know the real answer?
I'm just curious around numbers.
Yeah, so for me, 7 has always been a special number, and it has to do with my family. So my mom and dad wanted to have a large family, and they had 7 children.
Well, I'm one of 7. It's a very
You're
special
one of 7
number.
too. And I am the youngest of 7 children. And for me, 7 is just a solid number.
There we go. Brilliant. So we'll not leave our listeners curious as to why it was only 7.
Oh, there's one more answer there, Brendan, to be a little more serious about it. I thought I was going to write this book in 6 months, and it actually took me 2 years, because in the research phase, I interviewed 55 experts in business and mind-body medicine, etc. And I asked them all a similar question, which is, when you talk about leading from the heart, what are you really talking about? And I got a dozen different answers. And when I did my analysis and I mapped them onto the research that I had been doing, going back through history, what are the traits from the heart of all the best leaders? These 7 really were the ones that stood out. So that's really the true answer.
Brilliant. Well, look, we've teased our listeners with these 7. Let's just work our way through these, and from a leadership lens, and give our listeners an understanding of how they can leverage these traits in order to lead more effectively, which will ultimately prolong their lives and hopefully their efficacy as leaders, and ultimately their team will feel the benefit. They'll feel the benefit, their team will feel the benefit, and the organization will ultimately benefit as a result of leveraging these 7 traits. And the first one you mentioned is steadiness. What do you mean by that?
The first thing I do when I'm called to see a patient who's in cardiac distress is I check the heart rate. And if the heart rate is irregular, or if it's way too fast, 2 or 3 times normal, I don't waste time talking about what happened to them 10 years ago. I first focus on steadying the heart. Before we can talk about compassion and empathy and culture, we have to be steady ourselves. So that's what I mean by steadiness is, do we as leaders have real world practices that we can do in the moment when something knocks us off onto our heels, whether it's news of a financial issue or it's a personal call from home? Can we steady ourselves? Because what we know from the science of social psychology is that when we are stressed and imbalanced ourselves, even without words, when we walk into a room, other people have a similar experience in their bodies and minds and hearts. So the first timeless trait of a heartful leader is to be able to steady their heart. Now, takes many forms. This means, first of all, calming the body when we feel panicked and nervous and we're sweaty and our heart's beating fast. And this may be as simple as using the breath. And I outline several different breath practices. The Navy SEALs and the Marine Corps use these practices. There's so many that we can tap into, but the key isn't which one we use. It's just to know, wow, when I take an inhale and I exhale slowly from my diaphragm and spend more time than I did on the inhale, I'm actually activating the most powerful nerve in the body called the vagus nerve. And does everyone know that that relaxes the heart? It steadies it. And that other people can start to see the impact so that my team members start to calm down themselves. So something as simple as a breath practice and something that may be a little more complicated to steady our hearts. And for me, steadiness is the whole science of managing our stress. I mean, there are books written about it, but I shoved it into one trait. And so I also talk about this concept of cognitive reframing, which is, oh my gosh, the news is terrible today. Well, hold on a second. Who says? That's one interpretation. And so the science of positive psychology is really at the root of this book as well, which is the evidence-based approach to living well. And so steadiness is really, Brendan, do we have the skills as leaders to steady our bodies, our hearts, in moments of stress and chaos so that we can be the anchor for others? And do we have the skills to steady our minds, to not let them go off in a million places so that we can move on to the next timeless traits? Because without steadiness, everything else is worthless.
I'm smiling as you articulate the essence of steadiness. I became a breathwork instructor actually because I went on a retreat back in 2019 following, and I can disclose this, my daughter went through a challenging period with her high functioning autism. And I was exploring ways of steadying my own heart at that stage, which would ultimately calm the environment in which she was in her home. And I became a breathwork practitioner. I qualified as a Wim Hof method instructor, and we now coach breathwork, simple box breathing, some of the Wim Hof method breathing practices as well within our own program. And I would assert that we would have saved millions of pounds, both in terms of different decisions and potentially avoiding wrong decisions and making the right decision more often within our previous business if we had taken 2 or 3 minutes just as a board, as a senior leadership team, to actually practice a couple of rounds of box breathing. Because everybody typically came into meetings, frustrated, maybe hurried, with their own idea of their agenda for this meeting, often mobile phone glued to the rear, laptop underneath, laptop maybe open during the meeting, they're one eye in the meeting, one eye on the laptop, maybe another eye on the phone, and all very distracting. And so I feel passionately about this trait of steadiness and ultimately creating the environment within yourself, the calm within yourself, so that ultimately you can make a decision harnessing all of the potential of a calm mind, as opposed to narrowing your potential to leverage that, to leverage the potential within your mind. So I'm passionate about this. I love this, and the idea of reframing, again, really powerful. But I think you can only reframe if you've actually if you've taken those few breaths first of all to say, hold on. Let's just assess this. So love this. And so steadiness is the anchor for the other 6 traits. Yeah. The second trait, wisdom. So how do we harness this heart trait of wisdom, and how do you connect wisdom to the heart in the first instance? I'm curious to understand, Jonathan.
Yeah. When I think of wisdom, I think of my mom. And so when I was a boy, I would go into her room, and she always had a stack of books at her bedside table. Now, remember, my mom was a nuclear physicist back in the 50s and 60s. And so you might think that all of the books were about science, but they weren't. They were all about the wisdom of the ancients and philosophers, Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy. She was always trying to sort of figure out what is true. And remember, she's also running a family of 7 children. She's married, and she's a leader in town. And this is what she chose to spend her time doing in her free time. And for me, this idea of wisdom, which I think is forgotten, I think, the wisdom that we all seek for now, it has to be 10 seconds on TikTok, right? This is the wisdom that I'm getting and my children are getting. And my invitation to leaders is to remember that there is another guide. And it goes back thousands of years, and all we have to do is open a book. And so as I wrote this book, I thought, why is it that those heart-centered leaders also value wisdom? What is wisdom in the first place? And so I discovered that there are many types of wisdom. There's emotional wisdom, intellectual wisdom, creative wisdom, business wisdom, first of all. And second of all, there are certain characteristics that wise people have. Number one is humility. We all know that leader who comes in and said, this is the way it's always been, this is how it's going to be, and you're going to all follow my lead. And that, in my opinion, is not wisdom. And on the other hand, we all know leaders who have done their homework, and at the same time, they'll come into a space, and before deciding where everyone is moving, they're going to practice listening to each person. Listening deeply and asking what's important to you as we move forward. So a core of wisdom is humility. Another core of wisdom is deep listening to all of those around us. Another core of wisdom is perspective taking. So the best entrepreneurs I know, yes, look at the future and can see around corners. Where's the market going before others can see it? They also take chances. But even better than that are those that know the past, that know the industry, and that can recite it to you. So for me, wisdom is the ability to take very broad perspective of both the future and the past, and laterally seeing those around you. And you asked me, well, what does wisdom have to do with the heart in the first place? And I believe, and I describe this, and some people think I'm maybe a little out there, but the heart itself has a wisdom. You know, if the heart is lacking blood flow in one area, the other parts of the heart can take over. In an instant, the blood vessels can dilate if there's a blockage in one spot. In fact, when someone has a STEMI or a blocked artery, a heart attack in one blood vessel, and we take a look at the arteries, we find that the other blood vessels have seen the problem and have grown their own little branches to supply what's missing. This is wisdom. Wisdom is also working in community. So I really believe that the heart itself has a wisdom, not just physically, but emotionally. It's about emotional wisdom that the best leaders can tap into. And then, of course, since it's a book that has some science in it, I explain how wisdom itself as a trait, as a personality, is associated with living healthier and longer life. And you could imagine the reasons, right? You make better decisions about your health, about how you relate to other people, about your business, you're more successful. Sean Acor wrote about the happiness advantage. Is it that happier people have better business, or people with better businesses are happier? Who cares? Wisdom lies at the root of happiness. They're intertwined. So that's a little bit about the trait of wisdom.
It's so powerful, and you just described my STEMI whenever I was getting the feedback from the cardiologist, said all of these, and I learned this new language, these new collaterals, these new branches have been activated as a result of the blockage to the LAD, and I took great comfort from that. So, but I'd never used the term wise heart, but the reality is, I suppose my heart was telling me things for 6 months. And I didn't listen. When I think of wise leaders, the late great Charlie Munger, incredible wisdom, everything you just described Charlie Munger, his business partner Warren Buffett, our recent guest Bob Chapman, of course. So I love that. The next trait, the third trait, openness. How do we cultivate openness in the context of being better scaling leaders?
Yeah. Openness means openness of heart, which means being open to our own emotions, what's coming up, and not stuffing them down, bottling them down for years, because they'll come out onto those that we lead in terms of frustration, anger, resentment, and toxicity. So openness means doing our own work. And that just may be journaling. It may be going to a therapist. It may be reading a book, whatever it is. Are we open to our own experiences, or are we so busy moving forward, better, faster, that we don't take time to open up to ourselves and the truth of our lives? Openness also is a two-way street. If you look at your relationship as a leader, forget about at workplace, look at your significant other, look at your children. Are you someone who leaves for work at 6 in the morning and then comes home after everyone's in bed? Or you come home for dinner and everyone eats on their own or is on their phones, and you don't share what's happening inside of you? That's not an open person. And so openness doesn't just mean being open to others. It also means opening up ourselves and sharing of ourselves so that those that we lead lean in. There's this concept called heliotropic leadership, which, you think about your plants in the garden. Where do they point? They point to the sun. Why? Because the sun is bright, the sun is giving, the sun is generous. And so if we can be open with the best parts of ourselves with others and share our values all the time, others tend to want to support the mission of the group more so. And then openness is, of course, how can we practice it? We can read every day. We can listen to a podcast every day. We can listen to a news station that's different than our own. We can challenge our existing beliefs without feeling threatened, as if something bad is going to happen if we consider a new perspective. That's what openness is about.
Oh, it's so incredibly powerful again. And I feel this is changing, and I certainly hope it's changing. I see the change within the leaders who come through our own program, where there is a paradigm there that, you put this suit, and it literally, I think prior to COVID, it was a suit. Thankfully, that's been relaxed. But, this uniform we put on, and we believed as leaders we must behave in a certain way and kind of have this front that we don't show any level of vulnerability whatsoever. But time and time again on this podcast, and the people that I interview who are incredibly successful encourage leaders to show a level of vulnerability, because ultimately you forge relationships, meaningful relationships, which ultimately ignite within your team something that has them such that they will go through a brick wall for you. It no longer is a transactional relationship. There's the contract. I'm paying you X amount per hour. You come in here at 9, you leave at 5, and for that transaction, I get some portion of your head. But when things really start to fire up, when we actually get people's hearts, what we're saying is being open and challenging your own beliefs, willing to listen to others, willing to read other material, listen to others' perspectives, helps actually cultivate that level of openness to allow potentially different conversations and to allow others in who may not necessarily hold your point of views. Again, it's so powerful. The fourth trait, wholeness. So what has wholeness got to do with the heart and with leading with the heart?
You just described it perfectly. And when I think about the 7 traits, I think about it in a way as kind of a mountain. And at the top of the mountain is really wholeness right in the middle there. And we'll get to the end. Wholeness has a lot of meanings. And when I interviewed those 55 experts, people that I admire who are these heart-centered leaders, and when I read Brené Brown, she talks about wholeheartedness. I mean, it's the core of what she does. We all use this phrase. We all have heard the phrase, do it with your whole heart. And I said, well, what do we really mean by that? How can you do something with your half heart? And so it has different meanings. The key meaning, number one, is with passion. So when we do something wholeheartedly, we're not kind of, pardon my French, half-assing it, right? Or half-hearting it. You know that person, you know that friend who, when you're with them, they're not on their phone half of the time. They're not worried about something that happened a minute ago. They're locked in. And so for me, this is when I spent a lot of time, about 10 years, practicing meditation, mindfulness, going on silent retreats at Zen monasteries and going over to Oxford and learning how to become a teacher and this stuff. That's not so that I could become a better leader. It's so that I could live wholeheartedly. That's what mindfulness is about. It's about being fully present and locked in every moment of your life, even if it may be, other people may say, what's wrong with that guy? He's so intense. Yeah, it's also the ability to back up and to slow down. But it's that ability to make a choice. If you want, in the moment, can you be fully present, fully immersed, not only in what's happening strategically around you, that's strategic awareness for business leaders, but can you be aware of what's happening in the hearts and minds of everyone around you in the room, whether it's one person or 1,000 people? That's the level of wholeness that's required, I think, to be an effective leader. And it's possible. And in order to become whole, we have to look at our views on wholeness or brokenness. And I know a lot of people who just say, something horrible happened to me 30 years ago or when I was a child, something very, very bad, and I've never gotten over it. So wholeness also means a willingness to look back at our own lives and to feel into, are we broken? Are we living our lives as if we're broken? As if there's something wrong with us, as if we have something to prove all the time? Or have we done the hard work, the painful work, the emotional work, the honest work with ourselves to bring our whole self, what Carl Jung called the shadow self, the darker sides, the sides that we don't show to other people? Can we bring the darkness and the light together into our whole being? The best leaders have that ability to be honest. That's what attracts people to them. So living with your whole heart is living with integrity. It's living in the moment. It's being fully present with others. It's integrating your own past so that you can direct your energy towards a very clear future.
It's clear you have done a lot of work, because I can feel you being absolutely 100% present right now. And that's despite the fact that you've 3 teenagers upstairs and it's early morning with you, and you've had a late night being on call, but yet you're so incredibly present. I feel it right now. So I'm curious, what you mentioned, you visited Oxford, you've went on Zen retreats. Is there anything specifically that has been a game changer for you, Jonathan, in terms of a practice that has just kind of lit you up and really unlocked the person that I see in front of me right now? Or has it been a compounding of lots of different things?
I'll simplify it, and there's been 2 practices. In the book, I think there's 120 different practices, depending on what we're interested in. But for me, when I'm sharing these skills with people, sometimes people say, we don't want to hear all about leadership. We just want this one skill of presence. Teach us that, and everything else will fall in place. And so for me, the game changer was this skill of presence, being fully present. I had lived for 40 years with a mind that was all over the place. I watched a Monty Python skit yesterday, Brendan. It was on YouTube, and it was the Olympic sport of 30 athletes who have no sense of direction.
I've seen this.
And so they're all at the starting line, and the referee blows the pistol, and they all run in different directions.
I've seen this.
Yeah, and so it was so perfect for this question that you're asking me. Because the game changer for me was to realize that my mind was running in all these directions, intellectually, with curiosity, emotionally. And when I began this practice of mindfulness, and for me, it was just struggling to sit still for a minute and focus on my breath. And if someone's listening and they've never done the practice before, you can start with that, or you can build your way up to spending a week in total silence, which is a different story. Right? So the basic practice for someone who wants to begin this is, can you sit quietly in a room with no stimulation, maybe looking at a wall, and notice what comes up in terms of boredom. Notice where your mind is. Does it go into the future? Does it go into the past? Does it judge yourself? Does it judge others? And without judgment, just kindly noticing the nature of your own mind. For me, that was a game changer. And practicing that for 10,000 hours, often very frustrating, but sometimes quite blissful, helped me move from that Monty Python runner who was running all over at the start line to someone who, if I have to, I can stay in my lane and go hard and fast for a long time. And if I want to and choose to, like in these conversations, I can go off the tracks and then come back. And so that's game changer 1. The second game changer, which we may get to later, it's a whole nother conversation, is this concept of compassion. Compassion for ourselves. Compassion for ourselves. Compassion for ourselves. Compassion for others. And why do I say compassion for ourselves 3 times? Many of us in the healing professions, in the giving professions, in the serving professions, we are on fire about helping other people, and we often do that. It's like the 20,000 hearts story. We do that, but we forget to look after the one person who is giving and giving. And so the practice of self-compassion is, in the extreme simple case, it's, do you have the ability, I don't care if you're a woman or a man or anyone, do you have the ability to hold yourself and to hug yourself and not be embarrassed and say to yourself, I love you. I love you, and I'm there for you, no matter what life brings. For me, there's no bigger game than loving yourself as deeply as you want to love other people.
Again, this is so powerful. The practice of being truly present. Is there something prior to this podcast starting, for example, today, that you did to center yourself, you did to ground yourself? What, you know,
Yeah.
what was going on kind of for the 10 minutes prior to the podcast?
Yeah. Well, there are two simple things that I do, and it doesn't take 10 minutes. I didn't have 10 minutes. And I did. But if I had 10 minutes, I would have sat in meditation quietly and sent good wishes for myself and for you. But if I have 30 seconds, or if I'm about to give a talk on stage for 100 or 1,000 people, very simply, I ground myself by waking up to the sensations in my body. I'm really good at being up here. Like Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So my identity was thinking all the time. But if I'm going to be here with you and really try to be honest with you, I have to be not just in my mind, but I have to be in my body and in my emotions. And for me, it was a revelation that our emotions are not felt in the mind, not at all. Emotions can be thought or conceived of in the mind, but people that you and I know who really are people, emotional people that can cry and can laugh and can love life, these are people who are in their bodies. They can feel it. Like you said at the beginning, you felt the hair on the back of your neck. You're a person who lives your feelings in your body. You're not stuck in your mind. So the practice before coming into a podcast or going on a stage, whatever, number one is grounding myself in the body, usually by getting curious about the sensations in the soles of my feet, feeling the earth beneath me, feeling what's happening in my chest, noticing if there's any excitement, energy levels, using my breath to calm the body. And then the second piece, it's kind of like a 1-2 punch. So the first is the steadiness piece that we talked about. And the second is, we're coming to that at the end of the conversation, but I'll jump to it right now, is the warmth. Now, every leader doesn't have to be warm. I think the world would be better if they all were warm-hearted. But for me, that's a strength of mine. It's a strength of mine. So I try to dial that up a little bit before conversations like this. And the way that I do that is I send a simple wish. I wish that this conversation will be of service to Brendan and everyone in his community. That's it.
Wow.
And I'm ready.
Wow. And I can feel that warmth, so I appreciate that. It comes across really strongly. And this is, you know, we're not doing this in person, and I can feel it. So we're coming down the other side of the mountain. Wholeness is at the peak. Courage. We often hear about the importance of leaders being courageous. What does it mean in the context of kind of heart-centered courage?
Yeah. I mentioned this with wisdom, and I'll mention it again here with courage. It's not intuitive why courage should help your heart, the physical heart now, be healthier. It makes sense that it's part of our spiritual heart. Courage is part of the spiritual journey. Those of my patients and those that have done the best, people like you who've been through the healing journey, are not people who cower in the face of a diagnosis. They're people who dig deep and find strength in places where often last week I did something called the Spartan race with my family. And Joe DeSena has it in 40 countries around the world. Millions of people do this. So I did my first Spartan race, and he designed the Spartan race to help people develop courage and to see the courage that they didn't even know they had. So courage is good for the heart, first of all. Number two, the word courage, of all the 7 traits, literally comes from the Latin cor, which means heart. So the ancient warriors, the Spartans, even the Romans, they knew that courage somehow came from the heart itself. And I kind of explain that. There are a couple of aspects for courage, the privilege of coaching executives and CEOs. Courage comes from a few different places. Number one is a confidence in ourselves. So, and that's rooted in a way of talking to ourselves that's very supportive. People with courage are not constantly criticizing themselves and saying, you stink, you know, you're a loser. Yeah, maybe some feelings of being an imposter, but we get beyond that. So number one, courage is a confidence in ourselves in a broad sense, that no matter what life throws at us, we have a growth mindset, as Carol Dweck called it, that whatever the obstacle, even if it's a hard diagnosis, we'll either go through it, above it, below it, or around it, or maybe we'll pause and walk away. That's the wisdom piece. So courage is confidence in ourselves. Courage requires something else very important. You know, I have teenage boys, and I know you have teenage kids. They're very courageous, but it's not always based in real life experience.
It's not based in wisdom anyway.
I'm not talking. No, it's not based in wisdom. And that's not the kind of courage that I'm talking about here for leaders. I think authentic courage is based in competence. And competence is skill and ability that's born of 10,000 hours of committing to something, of testing ourselves again and again and again, so that we know that we can face very specific challenges. And then the third piece of courage that I think is essential is a conviction. It's not just, look how tough I am, look how masculine, some people might say, and this old notion of masculinity. The real courageous people that I know, whether it's the Dalai Lama, you know, Martin Luther King, whoever it is, these are people who believed in something that was much bigger than themselves, much bigger than any of their own selfish, greedy pursuits to line their own pockets. It was about making a difference that matters in the world in the time they had. So for me, courage is not simply facing fear or working through fear. And I talk about how to work with fear. That's a big part of it. It's also, can we feel confident in ourselves, which is rooted in self-love? Can we develop competence in a certain area, whether that's business or otherwise? And are we clear on what our convictions are beyond just getting to tomorrow and doing a 10% year over year profit increase? That's not conviction.
We could do a whole podcast on this alone. I love this topic, and it brings me back to the line in Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich. You know, what you can conceive in the mind and truly believe, then you can achieve. And I feel this belief, this self-belief, is the difference often between success and failure. The competence and the evidence of competence, it already exists within leaders who come into our community, and we're encouraging them really to think what they could achieve if they couldn't fail. You know, what does 10xing this business look like? And not growing for growth's sake, which is the ideology of a cancer cell, as Edward Abbey once said, but, you know, scaling with purpose. What if you could 10x this? You know, what might that look like? And often what holds them back is the fear that, well, you know, I can't do that. I don't believe I can do that. And I ask them simply to take their existing revenue line and divide it by 10 and say, at one point in this journey, you were 10 times less the size than you currently are now. So the evidence is there. You cannot tell me that you haven't 10x'd a business before, because you have. Clearly the results are there. I can get them on Company's House right now. So what's stopping you from doing this again? And it's just that inner belief. For some reason, they discount the fact that they've got this far. That, you know, in some way they've been lucky, or it was a stroke of fortune, or they won this customer, but they prevent themselves and limit themselves from actually leaning into what this could be in terms of 10xing this. They often won't even allow themselves to imagine what it could be, because then they get labeled fantasists or dreamers, or, you know. So the whole trait of courage, I feel ultimately this is the essence of scaling in the context of what you can accomplish, because often it's the start that stops most people. And I feel that the universe will reward that first step, that leaning in. You know, situations present themselves that are in your favor if you just have the courage to take that step. But often we get caught up in our heads, existing paradigm, belief systems, fear of judgment, fear of failure, all of those things start to kind of loom at large, which prevent us from really going for this, from really swinging for this. So I'm so passionate about this, and really encouraging leaders to examine their courage. And in this context, it's It's a case of, if you can, what I'm hearing from you, Jonathan, if you can think of something beyond yourself. You've mentioned a couple of wonderful leaders who lent in, who were courageous because they wanted to achieve something that potentially and ultimately they would not necessarily be beneficiaries of, but they knew it was worth pursuing. I've gone on a rant there, but that brings us in.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
Lightness. So I love this because ultimately this is probably the one that I struggle with the most in terms of really kind of leveraging lightness in the whole thing. You know, you mentioned a Stoic phrase earlier. There's another Stoic phrase, memento mori, that, you know, someday this will all be over. Remember, we'll be dead some point in time, that really, maybe none of it really matters. So how do we leverage lightness?
Yeah. Even before the how, I learned this, not just from Simon Sinek, but others, it's the why. You know, why bother? I could just see a leader, you know, somebody who's, you know, got huge company saying, well, what are you talking about? Lightness, gratitude, kindness, laughter. There's no place for that. It's all business. And those leaders ultimately, I think, run their own leadership into the ground, because you and I know that the best leaders light other people up. They light other. I made reference before to this concept of heliotropic leadership. You know, the sun. What does the sun do? The sun provides light. So if you're someone who's casting shade and shadows and darkness and criticism all the time to your employees, people are going to run away from you. But on the flip side, if you yourself are taking time outside of work to go climb a mountain, to spend time with family, to play the banjo, whatever lights you up personally, you can then spread that to others. People can see that, they can feel that, and it gives them more energy. It gives them more energy. And so for me, lightness has to do with those heart wakers. It's a trait. Lightness is a trait that no matter how serious life is, despite memento mori and the existential threat that, yeah, we're all going to be dirt someday. Yes. And by the way, a separate conversation is, can we make peace with that, with our own mortality? And those of us who've had life-threatening injuries have done some of that work. Because I think the wisest leaders who have the most lightness, who are able to laugh, are those that maybe have been closest to death. And the why of lightness, and this has been proven now many, many times, there's a hot body of research over the last 10 years, and I'm happy to see this, showing that these emotional states that light leaders have, gratitude, optimism, kindness, empathy, compassion, something that was thought to be sort of cuddly and no place in the business, love, like Bob Chapman talks about. These are not just feel-good emotions. These improve the success and sustainability of the most effective leaders and businesses. They improve the bottom line, and there's lots of reasons for that. And one of them has to do with reducing the stress burden on the hearts, the physical hearts of the people who work with you. Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford, business professor, wrote a book, highly recommended. It's called Dying for a Paycheck. And the focus of that book was around the heartbreakers, if I'm going to put it in my language. And so I want to shift the conversation now. Yeah, we know stress is bad. We get it. So what can I do for myself and those around me? You can cultivate these characteristics of light-hearted leaders and be a light-hearted leader. That's it. It's very simple. And it's also very hard, because turn on the news, right?
I tend not to anymore, and I don't encourage anyone within our community to switch it on. Unless you can control what is happening out there, then I feel for us it's about actually leaders controlling their controllables, which ultimately at some point will send a little ripple out to potentially positively impacting some of the things that we see out there. But ultimately, I've never found my emotional state being bettered by listening to the news. It's always better when I sit down and read a good book. And I feel wiser afterwards, but it's never been bettered by listening to the news. So moving on then, we've already referenced warmth. Is there anything else you want to pick up on warmth, the seventh trait and final trait of the heart, before we move into our close, Jonathan?
The whole purpose of the book, if you want to throw away the 13 chapters and throw away the final chapter on leadership from the heart, just read chapter 12. It's about warmth. And I really mean that. I really mean that. On the one hand, if I could give people 10 pages, it would be around how do we live with a warm heart? Because that's how we heal our own wounds. That's how we lead wonderful families. That's how we become part of communities. That's how organizations and companies grow and scale and collaborate and make the world better. It's only through warm-heartedness. And this has to do with ethical behavior. It has to do with empathy, compassion, kindness, and love. And yes, there's a science to it. And yes, it's good for the physical heart. And it's also beneficial for our emotional heart. This one trait of warmth, which is around empathy, compassion, kindness, and love. If you could only pick one trait, forget about the dozen others. Can you be kinder today? Can you be more empathic and concerned for others today? The greatest scientific research has shown, whether it's the Harvard longevity study or Dean Ornish's study of lifestyle medicine, or Dan Buettner's study of the blue zones, people who live to be 100, they all share only one trait. In my language, what they share, the people who live long and well, is warm-heartedness. That's it. This is where communities are born. So that's what I want to say about this seventh and most important trait.
Yeah. So profound. You have given an absolute masterclass today, Jonathan. I have a tradition on this show, and given the incredible life experiences that you've had, some of them not so good, some of them wonderful. You've got 3 of those wonderful life experiences upstairs. Can you share with our audience 3 timeless takeaways?
The first takeaway is something that I repeated to myself when I was in my lowest point as a cardiologist in the hospital, waiting for the next emergency. My family at home, I haven't slept for hours, and this will happen every week or so. Wondering when the stress will end, whether my life will get better, whether I'll find some purpose beyond just grinding day in and day out. And that was this idea that the sun will rise in the morning. Sun will rise in the morning. And my first message would be for those people who might be listening, who are either burning out or feeling stress, or feeling pressure, and it seems like there's no end. There's always a way forward. And it's a message of hope. And sometimes it means we have to do something that we've never done before, which is to ask others for help. So that would be the first timeless trait, is that it is true that the sun will rise in the morning. And if we can only lean on others and remember that we share just one heart, even though we've been taught and cultivated to believe that we've done it all on our own. Here's a secret: we have not.
You're here.
I would say the second has to do with an invitation to, are you living your life with your whole heart? Just a gut check right now. Are you holding back? Are you being held back by fears, by what ifs, by what if I look foolish? What if I'm judged? What if I don't succeed? What if I do succeed? Or are you really all in to this one precious life? And if you're not, that's okay. Just to know that there is a way of living that many of us went decades without, which is to live with your whole heart, embracing it all. And the last piece of timeless wisdom comes from my sister Andrea, who is with me every day in spirit, and with all of us, I believe. And it's something that she told me long before it was a popular thing. This idea of self-compassion and self-kindness. I was one of those people who beat himself up over and over and over every time I thought I failed or did something wrong. And it created chronic stress, and I was having chest pain and palpitations and nervousness and stomach problems. And Andrea saw all of this, and she said, Johnny, she called me Johnny, she said, can you just be kind to yourself? And so my invitation is, can you hear the way that you speak to yourself on a daily basis? Is the voice kind or unkind? Is it harsh or gentle? Is it loving or hateful? And no matter what the voice is, recognize that there are ways to shift the way that you relate to your own experience and move towards a place not only of self-trust, which is the foundation of every effective leader, but ultimately of self-love.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge everything that you've done, everything that you're doing. I've experienced firsthand, I didn't want to, but the work that your peers do, and it's incredible. It's literally life-giving and life-saving. You've also showed up today in an incredible way. Of 150 guests that I've interviewed, this has just been quite powerful and quite incredible. You're one of the most profound guests that I've ever interviewed, and I've interviewed some incredible people. So I really want to thank you and acknowledge you for everything that you've shared today, and you've shared it with authenticity, with humility, with vulnerability. It's incredible. I've learned a lot from just the way you've shown up today, Jonathan. So thank you for that. If people want to find out more about your work, about the wonderful book, and connect with you, how best to find out more, Jonathan?
Thank you so much, Brendan. I'm really moved by what you just said. I want to get that out and acknowledge that. It doesn't happen every day, this kind of exchange. I can't wait to see you in real life one of these days. I'll get on a plane tomorrow if I have to. And to reach me, to find me, you just Google Just One Heart. That's my message. We have just one heart. We have just one life. Take care of it. Take care of others' hearts. We share hearts, the same heart as others. Tap into that common humanity. So if you can just remember that message, you'll know how to find me. Brilliant. Just one heart.
Brilliant. And look, with everything that you have accomplished, what's next for you?
Well, my book is launching in India with a big publishing company, which is wonderful. So hopefully be heading over there. I'm heading to Washington, D.C. in October to speak at the International Mindful Leadership Conference there. And then I'll be heading to San Diego in December to speak at a Future of Health conference, speaking about the role of empathy, kindness, and compassion as technology continues to move forward. And we'll see what happens after that.
Brilliant. Well, as you continue to travel the world and evangelize about your incredible message and your important message, if you ever wish to stop off in Ireland, I would love to host you here, Jonathan. Once again, thank you. I know you've had a late night. You need to go and get some rest. Thank you so much. Really, I wish you every success with the book, with your message, with everything you're doing. And I look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, Jonathan. Take care.
Thank you so much, Brendan.